Before I get into the international crimes, I'd just like to do a little advertisement or a little reference to some text that you might want to look at. There's documents on the law of war, Robertson Gelf. There may be a more current edition than this one, but this has all the documents of all the places where you can find international legal norms on armed conflict. Look at how big this book is. There's a lot to the body of the law of armed conflict. Okay, and then there's also, this is my last book. It's called Human Rights and the United States, 2017, but in here there's a chapter in volume 2. This is one volume of 2 volumes. In chapter 2, there's a chapter on international humanitarian law and a chapter on international criminal law. So if you want to get a book that has that plus all the other rest of human rights law in it, all the documents, or at least parts of the documents that are worth looking at, this book might help you. Anyway, that's a resource. Okay, we're going to get into the major international crimes. For those of you who are skipping all of the course in international humanitarian law in the background, now we get into the nitty-gritty, the meat of what I'm trying to do in this whole process. It's to name the crimes and make us aware of what these crimes are and where they come from. And you can use your imagination as you recall the images in your mind, whether they're visual pictures on the TV, on the newspaper, or written reports on what happened about certain horrendous acts. Hopefully you can relate those images to some of the norms that you're going to hear here, the types of activities. For example, rape, something like that, or bombing children, something like that. So hopefully, as I go through these 4 sets of crimes, you will be able to relate them to what you've seen, what you've read, what you've heard, what Putin has said, what Zelensky has said, and you can connect the reality that you've accumulated from watching about the Ukraine since February 2022 and what you may have read, and you can connect that with the international legal norms. So we're going to talk about the first crime that I'm alleging that Putin committed. And Vladimir, I'm accusing you. The first international crime is the crime of aggression. Some learned news people and experts that they're interviewing on the TV have brought this up. But it's the crime of aggression, also called a crime against the peace. This came out of the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials as a crimes against peace. Eventually became the crime of aggression. It's starting the war without a legal justification. A legal justification in international law, not a legal justification in national law. Because I'm sure under Russian law, somehow the invasion of Ukraine was legal. So if you don't have a justification under international law, it constitutes a crime, an international crime, to start a war. Okay, this crime initially came out of Nuremberg trials as one of the 3 sets of crimes imposed on the Nazi war criminals. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against the peace. The crime that's also known as the crime of aggression. It is committed by an act of armed aggression. This crime is meant to deter or punish those who start an armed conflict. Starting or initiating an armed conflict without a legitimate legal basis, such as self-defense, is an international crime, an offense against all humankind because it threatens global or regional stability, security, and even international rule of law, which is at stake here. If the international community and the members of the states do not have a set of laws and ultimate minimal values that they that they subscribe to, then we're going to have Machiavellian might makes right type of politics in international relations, and we don't want that. There exists an international rule of law, and this humanitarian law is part of that body of international rule of law. So if you disregard these norms, disregard these rules of law, and you just say whatever happens, happens, and whoever's the strongest gets to win, then we're going to have a world of chaos and a world of hurt. So, the first crime, the crime of aggression. When Putin invaded the Ukraine in February 22, he arguably committed an act of aggression, also known as the crime of aggression or crime against the peace. Now, we know that he invaded in 2014 also. He took over some of the South, took over Crimea. Those were acts of aggression. The international community bitched and moaned, but they didn't really do anything strong to kick him out of there, which they could have done and should have done, like we kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Russia did not have the right to the sovereignty or the territorial integrity of Crimea, and whatever justifications it had were not valid as a matter of international law to justify them militarily going in there and taking over Crimea and the areas in Luhansk and Donetsk and the areas that the Russians have had under their control in the east and south since 2014. But the incursion in February of 2022 was itself a separate act of invasion, an act of aggression, clear, naked aggression. Putin tried to come up with some justifications. They were all specious. They were all BS, we call it. None of them was a justification of his invasion, which caused so much damage, so much loss of life, and almost threatened to topple the whole country of the Ukraine. Now, one source of the text of this crime is under customary international law, and it's found in the draft Code of Crimes against the Peace and Security of Mankind. Now, I'm going to read you the norm. I'm going to read you the criminal statute. Okay? Article 16 of the draft code. Now, the draft code is called the Crimes Against the Peace and Security of Mankind. So again, you're seeing the peace and security of mankind. It's about the whole world. It's about mankind. It's not about my country or your country or these countries in this region. It's about mankind. They're against the peace and security of all humankind, hence international crimes. Here's what the draft code says in Article 16. Crime of aggression. An individual who, as leader or organizer, actively participates in or orders the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of aggression committed by a state shall be responsible for a crime of aggression. Okay, very basic, a little bit vague, but the idea is anybody who participates, who organizes, plans, prepares, initiates, wages an act of aggression committed by the state shall be responsible. So the individual is responsible, not the state. If the state decides to go, it's the individuals who motivated that, who started that, who initiated that idea. Let's go attack this country and take them over for whatever reasons. So it's to try to stop armed conflict from happening. That's the best way to protect human beings and non-military people's places and things. The second source of the crime of aggression comes in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. As amended, they added the crime of aggression. It was a very politically divisive crime because the way it was drafted originally back in like 1998 and around that time they were putting together the Rome Statute, any country could be accused of committing aggression, especially like the United States. And so the definition that was offered did not take place. And then they eventually had a conference in Kampala, which came up with a draft that has been accepted by the parties to the treaty and accepted as the definition of aggression, which the International Criminal Court is using, and which I think is declarative of customary international law, though Vladimir Putin would not accept it. This is what the crime of aggression is in the Rome Statute. Now, again, Russia has not ratified the Rome Statute, so they're not strictly speaking bound. But the Ukraine would accept this as the norm applicable to acts happening in the Ukraine. The crime of aggression. For purposes of this statute, crime of aggression means the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution by a person in a position effectively to exercise control over or to direct the political or military action of a state of an act of aggression which, by its character, gravity, and scale, constitutes a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations. And that's a very loaded initial definition of the crime of aggression. And it involves an act which violates the Charter of the United Nations, which almost all the countries of the world have ratified the Charter of the United Nations. Not all, but most. And so they're tacking the definition to the UN Charter, violating the Charter, which everyone is subscribed to and is the founding document of the UN. The International Criminal Court is not a branch of the UN. It is not a branch of the UN. It is a separate independent judicial body which is established by treaty, by the Rome Statute, and it has a relationship by agreement, by contractual agreement with the United Nations. Okay, so it's not an arm of the UN. It's not directed by the UN. It's its own separate body. There's a lot of accusations politically about how it acts and who it's prosecuting, but it is a separate legal entity answerable to the Assembly of States parties to the treaty, the states that have accepted to be bound by the treaty. Russia has not been bound by the treaty and so is not subject to the court as a state party. The United States has not become a state party to the International Criminal Court. It has signed the Rome Statute, but it has not ratified the statute, which is the act necessary by the U.S. Senate to transform the Rome Statute into U.S. law. The U.S. should do it, but the reasons that it's not doing it are specious and bogus to me. But basically, we're afraid that our soldiers will get arrested on the battlefield and accused falsely of committing these horrendous crimes against humanity or war crimes. So that's politics aside. So we're in the Rome Statute, the definition. I just read the definition of the crime of aggression. For Article 2, for the purpose of Article 1, act of aggression means the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state, or in any manner inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations. Any of the following acts, regardless of a declaration of war, shall, in accordance with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3314, qualify as an act of aggression. So there's a list of acts that if a state does them, the individuals who initiated them will be considered to have committed an act of aggression and hence the crime of aggression. So this says, regardless of a declaration of war. Normally what happens between two or more countries is someone declares war. Japan declares war on the U.S. declares war on Germany. You declare war. Declaring war creates a legal relationship between two states. Again, we use the law of armed conflict as a term, not the law of war, because war, again, the relationship between two states, though we commonly in the world uses the word war when they see bullets flying and things blowing up. We're using the term, since we're now enlightened, the term armed conflict. Okay, so I'm reading the definition of the act of aggression in the Rome Statute, which is much more lengthy than the Draft Code of Crimes Against the Peace and Security of Mankind, which is a very vague and a very brief description of the act. So they're going to try to give us some examples of the types of things that constitute an act of aggression, so that it's better, easier to apply these to a particular situation. Now, these qualify as an act of aggression, these following. A, the invasion or attack by the armed forces of a state, and remember, state means country, of the territory of another state. So state A attacks state B. Or any military occupation, however temporary, resulting from such invasion or attack, or any annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state or party thereof. So that's A. I think you can see this is exactly what Putin did. Also regarding the annexation that he's trying to do with Korea and the parts in the east, Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk and whatever those areas are that Russia wants to make part of Russia. Actually wants to make all of Ukraine part of Russia, and we'll get to that eventually. Now here's B, the second type of act which qualifies as an aggression. Bombardment by armed forces of a state against the territory of another state, or the use of any weapons by a state against the territory of another state. So state A is lobbing missiles into state B. That is an act of aggression, even though you're not going in there physically with your soldiers. Bombardments, okay? C, the blockade of ports or coasts of a state by the armed forces of another state. We know this has happened in Ukraine. Blocking the ports, putting mines, and sealing off access to Odessa and the ports along the southern coast. Mariupol and all of those ports that have been blockaded, basically taken over by the Russians. D, an attack by the armed forces of a state on the land, sea, or air forces or marine and air fleets of another state. So if the soldiers of a certain state are in state B, and the soldiers of another state attack the soldiers in state B, that is an act of aggression, even though it doesn't take place in the state where those soldiers come from. Okay? E, the use of armed forces of one state, which are within the territory of another state, with the agreement of the receiving state, in contravention of the conditions provided for in the agreement, or any extension of their presence in such territory beyond the termination of the agreement. So if a country allows another military of another country to come into the country, and the country that comes in violates the terms of their access they're allowing to come in, or if they stay longer than they're supposed to stay, then that constitutes an act of aggression, even though they're not shooting each other. Okay? So that's an act of aggression. And aggression does not mean bullets are flying. It means certain acts and uses of force are being made which interfere with one state running its own country, and other state interfering with its functioning, even though that may be outside of the state, or in this case, inside its own state, when those other foreign military don't leave or don't comply with the conditions for them staying in the country. F, the action of a state in allowing its territory which it has placed at the disposal of another state to be used by that other state in perpetrating an act of aggression against a third state. So, again, the action of a state in allowing its territory which it has placed at the disposal of another state to be used by that other state for perpetrating an act of aggression against a third state. So, if Russia were to ask Belarus if it could send its troops through Belarus and keep some troops and resources there in Belarus, in order to